Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to focus on the filter panel, which is a data visualization in its own right, and you can learn quite a lot, even staying exclusively within the panel. So before we start, let's kind of move the 3D canvas out of the way, and we'll even use this spread slider to make it narrower, so it's just kind of all on the left there. And then we'll open the filter panel with that button, and we'll expand it with this button. So here it is. And we see there's a number of banks of buttons here in different categories, and there's some sliders in some of these categories too. And here we go, that's the entire filter panel. Now let's say that we're interested in a particular brand of paper. Let's look at Apex. Okay, so now we've clicked this button, which applies this filter to the data. So now everything that remains in the data has to satisfy this filter. Everything that remains has the brand Apex. And some things have happened visually. So over on the left, we can see that the 3D canvas is updated. And it looks like there's a bunch of items that have been dimmed, sort of backgrounded. Those are failing to satisfy the filter. And the ones whose colors remain bright, those are satisfying the filter. So these are the Apex paper samples. And since this is a grid organized by base color, we see here, you can see that Apex has a pretty good spread actually across the base colors. These are cool colors on the bottom, warm colors at the top. I would say they tend toward the warm, but there are examples down in the cool range too. So there's a lot of diversity in the warmth of the base color for Apex. But now looking back just at the filter panel, we can see a number of visual changes have happened here as well. One thing is that the Apex button now has a blue outline. That means that it is part of the filter definition. There are no other buttons like that because we haven't selected any other filters, right? So there are some buttons in other categories that still have their background color, and so they satisfy the filter, but they're not part of the filter definition. We could click them and add them to the filter. So now everything is Apex and double weight, but for now, let's just leave it at Apex. We see additionally that all of the other brand buttons have lost their color, meaning that they all fail to satisfy the Apex filter, which you should expect because only Apex can satisfy the Apex filter. If we expand the brand section here, we see all of the brand buttons. And because there are so many, you can understand why we have this button that can hide most of them. Otherwise, we'd be taking up so much screen real estate. But anyway, this is the way to see all of the brands. We can see there's a lot of brands in our data. Additionally, we've seen this little counter over in the bottom right corner. If we mouse over, we can see it says number of filtered items. There are 108. So we know there's 108 Apex samples in our data. And if we look up at the manufacturer section here, it kind of looks like all of the manufacturers have failed to satisfy the Apex filter, but in fact, we can expand the manufacturer section. Just like we did with the brand section, we see, okay, Apex must be a DuPont/Defender paper. And because DuPont Defender is the darkest of these three buttons, it means that it is the highest frequency in the data. And the lightest color is the lowest frequency. So most Apex papers are DuPont Defender, some are DuPont, and a few are Defender. And we can see, if we're interested in the exact numbers here, we could click, say, Defender, and now we look, there's only 12 left. So 12 of these examples are Defender Apex, 66 are DuPont Defender Apex, and 30 are DuPont Apex. So anytime you see these kind of background colors, they are indicating the frequency in the filtered data. And so if you haven't filtered anything, they indicate the frequencies in the entire data. And if you've applied some filters, then the colors of these things update to reflect the new filtered subset of data. So among Apex brand papers, these are the relative frequencies of these manufacturers. Okay, so basically it's a DuPont Defender paper. So we can look at the other banks of buttons to learn additional things about this brand. Okay, so to begin with, we can look at this year slider, and we see that something has happened here. There are these little marks in the interior of the slider, under which are printed these years. So what this tells us is that, at least in our data, all of the Apex brand samples were made between 1937 and 1972. Okay. Now, we haven't, strictly speaking, filtered the data by year. I mean, indirectly, we kind of have filtered out some years, but we haven't set these sliders at all, right? It's just these marks are telling us that this is the range of dates that satisfies the filter. If we wanted to move these marks right on to these points here, we could do that if we wanted, but it wouldn't change anything unless we started adding additional brands, right? So we could do that if we want to see how this would change if we added additional brands that might exist outside of this kind of relatively narrow range. We could do that. And so if we're interested in, for example, like Argo, so Argo apparently is a much older brand, or at least it started much earlier, and goes all the way back to 1912. So we can see that if we make our brand filter more permissive, so here we have two disjuncts, Argo and Apex, now we have a wider year range. But let's get rid of the Argo filter and just focus on Apex. So in our data, all of our samples of Apex are between 1937 and 1972. And if we want, we can get a better look at what that looks like across the years by doing a histogram of year. So we select year here, and we select the histogram view, and now we can see here sort of how they are distributed across the years. It starts back in 1937, but the bulk of them appear to be somewhere in the sort of mid to late 40s to maybe mid 50s. That's where most of them are sitting. The examples that satisfy the filter are kind of spread across these histogram columns. If we want them to be more localized, we could actually sort the Y direction of the histogram, sort the columns by brand, and then that would at least bring them closer together. And we see, that kind of helped. But what that means is that vertically they are sorted by brand, and so you're going to get these pockets of Apex together. You have them on top and underneath because of how these histograms are created, but you can see they're kind of bunched together a little easier to see. Now let's go back to the grid, because our focus actually isn't the 3D visualization, but rather the filter panel. But in any case, we now can see these are still sorted by year. And so we can see, there's a little bit of a spread, but we don't have anything particularly old or particularly new. Because both the LML packages and sample books are still colored buttons, it means that we have at least one package of Apex, and then it looks like we probably have a lot of them in the sample books. And it turns out, so for example, so 75 of the 108 are in sample books, and 33 come from packages. We looked at thickness. We can look at base color. So if you were doing a kind of historical study on the Apex brand, this is an interesting place to start, because you can look at, what are all the color offerings that were available for the Apex brand? We have something called blue white, cream white, pure white, natural white, buff, and white. Now, blue white is kind of interesting. I don't know that I've ever heard that brand term before. So if we click it, there's just a few examples. There's only 3. And let's say we add these to the panel and then look at their base colors. They're pretty cool colored. And if we sort the grid again by color, we can see, okay, yeah, they're kind of cool colored, but this one here is on the kind of on the warm side. This one's pretty cool. These might both count as like a blue-white, but it's a little surprising that this one is called blue-white. So it's possible, for example, that maybe it has aged or whatever. This is the one that sort of looks the bluest. But we might wonder, so is that a term that only Apex used? Okay, well, let's find that out. So we've now clicked blue-white, but the problem is we still have Apex selected, right? So let's deselect that, and we'll see if any other brands come through. There's Apex, and there's something called Cellofix that is also called blue-white, and then a few others, Varigam and Velour Black. So that's interesting. And now if we look up at the manufacturers again, Defender, right. Yeah, so that's interesting. Apex papers that are called blue-white were only made by Defender, not by DuPont or DuPont Defender. So that's interesting. And then another company called Schutzmarke, which must be German. And then these are the other sort of like brand names. And so if we were interested, for example, in, well, what's Schutzmarke? What were they making? Okay, that's Cellofix. So there's a paper called Schutzmarke Cellofix that also uses the term blue-white. But primarily we have these Apex Defender papers that are called blue-white. And then if we look again at our year sliders, we now see, okay, it's between 1945 and 1939, it looks like. So that's interesting. So during World War II, 39 to 45, Defender was making Apex in a color called blue-white, and it doesn't appear anywhere else outside of that range. So just looking really exclusively in the filter panel, we've learned something maybe historically interesting. And obviously you can't do the entirety of your historical research on the Paperbase website, but that would give you an interesting starting place. We can also look at a couple other things if we're interested. Okay, all of these blue-white papers are called glossy. None of them contain any backprints in our data. Let's see about surface. Okay, it looks like there's a surface called R that was used in these cases. And so if we look at surface R, and then if we maybe deselect, well, actually here, let's kill all of our filters first. And then let's go back to surface R. And we'll see if it was used anywhere else. Okay, yeah, that must be used in other places. So surface R is something, a term that was used by a lot of manufacturers, not just Defender. Kodak apparently has a lot of these. And there's a lot of different brands. Allura, okay, Ectolure is a Kodak paper. Varigam is a DuPont, I believe. Mural, Opal is a Kodak. Portrait proof, right? So this surface R was used across manufacturers. And we might be interested in, okay, well, it looks like R could appear in cream white, and blue white. So surface R could be different colors. What about textures? Well, smooth and semi-rough and tweed. So probably these aren't all the same surfaces. Now, we have 181 examples of R. We can add them to the panel. We can look at their texture images by clicking that. And we see, okay, yeah. So that term was used by different manufacturers in different ways, right? For Kodak, it's a fairly rough surface. For DuPont, it looks like a bit of a smoother surface, right? So that's an interesting thing. Despite having the same letter, they mean different things. And so we'd have to be careful, for example, if we were doing a historical analysis of that term, right? We would have to make sure we specify like which manufacturer is involved. And then if we'd like to look at some sample books here, well, here, let's go back and let's choose Apex. And now let's go back and see, okay, so these appear in some sample books, and it looks like maybe there's a bunch of them in this sample book. Well, here, wait. In this sample book, 4788, and we can come back up here and select Apex. Okay, and now we add these, and we can then look at these sample book images and get a better sense of what Apex looks like, right? In all of its variations. Okay, so we have seen that really just staying almost exclusively in the filter panel, we have been able to learn quite a bit about this particular brand and its history and related things like the surface that's normally associated with that brand is also associated with lots of other brands, and so on and so forth. So this is we've seen some of the power of the filter panel to allow us to analyze these things more deeply.